All right. We're back on air. I'd like to begin this memorial celebration of life for Robert with his own words. This is what he titled the final draft of my funeral speech, which he sent to me in November of 2022. These are the final words of a loving father, grandfather, great-grandfather, brother, brother-in-law, and uncle. There's an old Yiddish proverb that says, Leben is die begast Metzia, mir bekommen es vergornischt. Life is the biggest bargain. We get it for nothing. It was pretty wonderful, the journey of my life, and it lasted a lot of very fine years. If a universal theme could be applied, it's this. No one has figured out the meaning of life, other than to acknowledge that there's more than one way to live it. And now I'll hang around in my exceptional children, Ross and Anne, my remarkable grandchildren, Joshua, Chase, Drake, Connor, and Lydia, and my awesome great-grandson, Theo, and I'll add and Miller since he wrote this in November of 2022. To my son-in-law, Craig, and my daughter-in-law, Robin, we are all the better for it when you joined our family. And the same goes for Joe and Morgan as well. To my brother Arthur and sister-in-law Barbette, nieces Deborah and Karen and nephew Jonathan, their spouses and their children, I was very lucky to be a part of a loving family. We appear and then we disappear. And in between we try our best to do our best. There were some bumps along the way. But the times with Lois were good, and I'm grateful to Arthur and Babette for coming to my rescue. I was called by several names during my lifetime. Robert, Bob, Bobby. My bubby called me Bobbala. But the names I cherished the most, the ones that brought me overwhelming joy, were Daddy, Dad, Baba, and Grandpa. Oscar Wilde once said, "To live is the rarest thing in the world." But now it's time to say goodbye. With much love to you all, here is my last request. Turn to the sun, let the shadows fall behind, and every now and again, dream a little dream of me. Robert loved reading. He always had a house full of books, and he often gave out books to others. Some were a gift in whatever you were interested in, like the time Lydia was interested in calligraphy and she got a book about it. Connor majored in psychology, he got a book about it. Though Robert was disappointed that Connor changed his plans away from advertising because he had a lot of books on advertising, even if they were from the 1950s. Some of his books were loaners that he wanted back on his shelves, which were always full. No one could keep up with his speed of reading, and he read about a lot of things. But his favorite genre, he told me when we met last August, was crime fiction, espionage fiction. For a time, he focused on translated detective novels, especially from Scandinavian countries, along with his grandson Chase and Chase's wife Morgan. Any good detective novel has a few distinct parts to the story. Did I mix up the family connections there? Okay. Any good detective novel has a few distinct parts to the story. The setup, the character development, the plot twists, and the big reveal. We already know the end of the story, in this case, but maybe there's something more to learn along the way. So what was the setup for Robert's story? He was born in 1934, and he grew up with his parents and his younger brother Arthur on the north side of Chicago. His neighborhood, Hollywood Park, was around 85% Jewish, and Von Steuben High School might have been 95% Jewish while he was attending. He said he liked growing up in the late 40s, early 50s. The Eisenhower era could be dull, but he could go to the playground and be outside all the time, and he wound up being too old for the hippie era in the 1960s. His maternal grandfather had been a Torah scholar, but when he came to the United States, there was no work for him in that field, and so he rejected Judaism as a religion, which was a tradition that Robert's mother continued. Robert's father had had a bar mitzvah and personally was quietly religious, but Robert himself never went to synagogue or had a bar mitzvah for himself or sent his children. For him, 1 year of a Sunday school at a temple in Logan Square was about it. But still, Robert always thought of himself as a secular and cultural Jew, connecting in his own ways with his heritage, which answers one mystery that might have occurred to some of you. Why is a rabbi leading Robert's funeral? And the reality is that he found me. He had been interested in learning about possibilities of making plans for the end of his life, and he discovered that an approach called humanistic Judaism might fit for the kind of Jewish connection he had in his approach to life, theology, and philosophy. And so that's how we connected, and I had the chance to meet with him for about an hour and a half in his apartment just about 10 months ago. And so a lot of this storytelling is coming from Robert's mouth himself. Robert went to Carleton College, eventually, talking his way in, changing majors between chemistry, zoology, and political science before serving in the Army in the late 1950s. While in the Army, he was stationed in Germany, where he was recommended to be a teacher helping his fellow soldiers earn their GEDs for approximately $75 extra pay every month. And he told me that he had the best passing ratio of any of those teachers among his students. When he returned to the States, he had some money saved, and that's when he made his first big mistake. He had a chance to invest in the early days of a restaurant chain called McDonald's. Later on, he would also pass up a swampy property in Florida that would be bought by Disney, or on investing in the Bulls when they were still terrible. He did fine financially, but as Craig put it, he was the person closest to being super rich that you ever knew. Fortunately, he had a sense of humor about those near misses. After his Army service, Robert started a direct mail printing company after learning the business on commission, and that business was a success. It turns out he was a pioneer in hiring women for advertising jobs other than secretary, when that wasn't really being done. You can think of the show Mad Men if you've seen it. Robert then sold that business and moved on to working for CNA Insurance Company, starting in 1962. And he helped to introduce their Medicare supplemental gap insurance with a program called Golden 65, which was his branding and brainchild. He handled the messaging, the radio ads, and all the direct mailing, of course. He retired from that work in 1987, reaching the height of vice president. But here's where the plot twists, the character development begins. Robert married Lois in 1962, but the marriage ended around the time he retired from CNA. They remained on reasonably good terms. He even served as a pallbearer at her funeral in 1998. During his long retirement, Robert had a chance to explore his hobbies, like stage magic, reading, and appreciating jazz music. He had even liked jazz music when he was in high school, sneaking into what they called then black and tan clubs to hear musicians like Duke Ellington. His mother would have had a heart attack if she had known he was doing that, but he enjoyed it. He also loved his BMW automobile, specially adjusted to his 6'4" height. He followed sports, but didn't play basketball after high school, even if at times he was mistaken for a Chicago Bull. And he was a foodie, trying new restaurants all the time, eating sushi long before it was normal. And there was the secret of his cologne. When he was stationed in Europe in the Army in the 1950s, he once went into a shop in Brussels. And at the shop, they did some tests on your hair and your body, and they created a cologne specifically formulated to match with you. Not only did he try out this cologne, but he ordered that cologne for himself continuously until the 1990s, so 40 years worth. The most important character development for Robert, though, was his new title. As he said, the names he cherished most were Dad and Grandpa. He told me that he loved being a father. He was fortunate to have had a loving family, raising them in Skokie on Laverne in a house that had been built by Lois's father. He said they were good kids, they were good students, and they were fun to spend time with. He would be the pitcher for Ross's neighborhood street baseball games, and Ann and Ross's friends sometimes liked talking to him. He was a charming person at every stage of his life, even near the end with his caregivers. He was very close to his entire family, good relationships with his nieces and nephew, even becoming a pen pal with a great niece. Maybe his writing was one reason he stayed so closely connected, reading and writing. The family always received a special letter for special events, typed on his computer, then printed out onto paper, and then mailed. Cards are corny. Cards are the easy way out. Better to hand make something personal and put it in the mail. Robert told me that he loved being a grandfather, and more recently a great-grandfather. One of the positives, he says, about being a grandfather is the ability to visit and then go home. He loved attending dance recitals, even traveling to St. Louis to see his grandchildren dance. And he was happy that his grandchildren have turned out to be comfortable and happy that they are considerate and that they care for each other. He always took an active interest in what they were doing. Like when Chase was interested in radio, and Robert did more research to have more meaningful conversations about it. Or talking about being an early adopter of computers with Drake when Drake majored in computer science, or even having a secret handshake with Connor. There were nicknames like Butchie and warm memories of family vacations, all of them warm after that snowmobile incident. That's the character people remember, not a boring insurance ad executive, an active and living and loving presence in his family's lives. Robert took pride in his age. He was the oldest living Loevy, even though he didn't expect to make it much past age 80. As he said, he didn't buy any green bananas. But other than a mild colitis, he didn't really have very many health problems until the arrival of bladder cancer at age 88. Through that whole process, too, he kept a positive attitude and a realistic approach to life. He told me that dying is worse than death, the process more challenging than what happens at the end, which he accepted without fear. He kept his great memory and his charm all the way until the very end. And now here we are in a world without him. It's a world we've never experienced because he's been here. And now we need to get used to this new reality without him living in our lives. But that's the last twist to the story. Robert is not gone. He lives in his family, his children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, his brother and Arthur's family. He lives in the impact he had on other people and on the world. And he lives in memory. If you hear his voice, or read a book that he loved, or think of something he would have wanted to know, then he's back as a presence in your life. Or maybe if you put on some music he would have loved, you can feel him that way too. And we'll hear a piece of music from his repertoire of his loved music at the end. Two things Robert said very clearly to me. For his memorial service, he did not want a lot of Hebrew. And secondly, he wanted a chance for people to share stories about him as a way to celebrate his life. And so at this point, I will relinquish the microphone and invite those who would like to share something about Robert to come forward and to perhaps share your name, your connection to him or the family, and to share something about his life that will stay with you. I know that his children have some thoughts that they wanted to share as well. We'll let them go first. And then I invite you, if you're moved, to step forward and share something as well.
All right. Robert, Bob, Uncle Bob, Bobby, Baba. But to me, he was just Dad. My dad wants this not to be a time of sadness, but to be a time of happiness, to remember all the good things and good times we had. My dad lived a long life and had great experiences, but the ones most important to him were the ones spending with his kids, grandkids, and great-grandkids. I remember my dad taking me to Kittyland, which was just across the street from here, and that's where we won our first prize at the carnival. Growing up on Laverne and Skokie, I could still remember and I could still hear my dad calling us girls as he's pitching us baseball and playing sports. For one of my birthdays, he even took my friends, we had a camper, and he took my friends to Jellystone Park, where we spent the night grilling food, getting pine needles in our food, watching movies, etc. By the way, everyone in the neighborhood always knew when we came home with the camper because he had a musical horn that he was very proud of playing every time we entered the neighborhood. We spent many, many years flying to California to see my grandparents and always went to Disneyland, Universal Studios, SeaWorld, or Knott's Berry Farms because that's where my sister and I wanted to go. I can remember one year, also in California, where he came home one day wearing a toupee with my grandpa, that was like the thing to do in the 70s. My first trip to New York was with my dad, and I remember he was on business. He took me with, and we were approached by a professional woman. And I was young, and my dad was very polite, and I was a little young to really take advantage of the situation. Later, another great memory is my dad and I flew to Green Bay, Wisconsin to see a Rams game. And because my dad was doing business with George Allen at the time, I got to sit on the field and watch the game, which was very exciting. And then on the way back on the plane, I got Jim Neighbors' autograph. He was also on the plane with us, and I still remember that. My dad and I went to many other sporting events. One time we went to a Blackhawks game, and back in those days, tickets were hard to come by. We'd go up to the window, and they would say, sorry, there aren't really good tickets. My dad would give them money, and all of a sudden, lo and behold, a couple people didn't pick up their tickets. So we had these tickets available for you. We also went to Cubs games and other sporting events. Soon after college, I got married to my wife, Robin, and we've been married over 38 years, so my dad got to be a big part of a new family with new life experiences. I can remember one time going to Gina Giorgetti's. The line was a mile long, so we went up to the maitre d' and said, we need a reservation for 3 for Dr. Capelli. Thought a good Italian name would get us in. We did cut some time off. We had such a good time, though, that we had to take Robin's dinner home because she didn't eat a bite. And we still laugh to this day. We still laugh about that experience there. Not only did he gain a daughter-in-law, but on May 23rd, 1988, this is where he became Baba. A huge passion of my dad's was reading. My son Josh and he would spend hours and hours talking about book series that they both were reading and what series they should read next. They went on and on with this. Not until that long, it was only about a few months ago where my dad stopped really reading because it was hard to see, but they still talked about the books that were coming out in the series that they would do. Another passion my dad had, as the rabbi had mentioned, was coming to St. Louis to see my daughter Chase's dance recitals. He was a very proud grandpa and would sit through all 3 performances that lasted for several hours, each one, and he legitimately liked it. The rest of us had to endure it, but he enjoyed it and looked forward to it every year. Finally, my dad got to experience 2 great-grandchildren. Theo is now 3. He spent many times with my dad, and it made his day to find out what Theo was doing in school or what he was saying, and Theo constantly made my dad laugh with his quick wit. Miller, the newest member of the family, is a little over 2 months old, going to be 3 months next week, so not many stories yet. But my dad did get to hold him and constantly talked about him and gave him great joy that he was able to see Miller. He still talked to the very end about Theo and Miller every day we talked. As most of you know, I'm not a big reader. So instead, I will quote from one of my favorite musicians, Bob Marley. Open your eyes, look within. Are you satisfied the life you are living? I think my dad was satisfied.
When my dad was alive and nearing the end of his life, I felt that I knew exactly what I would say when this day arrived. But when the time came and he passed peacefully in his home last week, I struggled with putting my feelings and memories into words. How could I possibly express the love I had for my father, the love my family had for him, and the love my dad showed to all? Those who knew my dad loved him. We all loved him. How could you not? He was friendly, witty, charming, curious, creative, loving, fun, smart. He was also tall, so tall. He stood 6'4", taller than any other father I knew. I loved telling people that my dad was 6'4". When I told them this, they would always respond, "Oh, that's where you get your height." My brother Ross and I had a wonderful childhood. My parents were popular in the neighborhood and always welcoming. Friends would stop by and stay for hours, whether it was to play basketball in the driveway or just to hang out in the family room. And if my friends were lucky enough to be around during a mealtime, they were always invited to join us. We ate dinner together every night. It was really important to my parents. We always waited for Dad to come home from work during the week to eat, and we didn't sit down for dinner until 6:30 at the earliest. Food was a big part of our lives. My mom was a tremendous cook, and my dad was an expert on the grill, cooking up steaks, lamb chops, and even swordfish steaks. My dad loved to go out to restaurants, and no restaurant was too far away. We would frequent the nicest places. Bob Chin's. There was a fish restaurant in Evanston whose name escapes me. We went to a variety of Chinese restaurants, with the Palace being our favorite. And my parents loved to go out for sushi. Like the rabbi said, my mom and dad were eating sushi well before people even knew what sushi was. We would go downtown to the Happy Sushi and sit at the sushi bar, getting personal service from the sushi chef. We were also such frequent diners at Bob Chin's that our waiter actually invited my parents to his wedding. My dad loved to travel, and he and my mom would take some trips on their own, but they also planned a lot of amazing vacations for my brother and me. We went to Mexico often, where we would lay on the beach, and he would sit in the shade. We spent a lot of time in California, where my grandparents lived, and when my grandpa Jerry died, we drove his RV, which we called a camper, all the way from California back to Skokie. We all loved that camper. My dad would drive it around the cul-de-sac we grew up on, pick up the kids in the neighborhood, and take them out for Dairy Queen ice cream cones. And as Russ mentioned, the camper had a horn that played music, so the neighbors knew it was time to drop everything and they were doing when they heard the song. When my dad wasn't working, eating, and traveling, he was often listening to music, particularly jazz music. He loved music. I have memories of going with him often to the record store, where he would sometimes buy me a new album. He always wanted the latest and greatest in stereo equipment, and my brother followed his lead. I would usually take the hand-me-downs, which were still state-of-the-art equipment. I remember music playing in my house for hours each day. Growing up, my dad was really supportive of my extracurricular activities. He showed up to my high school track meets, and he went to all of my dance recitals. When I went off to college, he visited me often and made an effort to get to know my new friends. I also leaned on him in college when I struggled in my English class. I did not appreciate classic books from the past like my father did, and he would walk me through them when I needed help with my assignments. And speaking of books, as others mentioned, my dad loved to read. I mean, he really loved to read. He had thousands of books, and not only had he read them all, he remembered them. He enjoyed discussing books with anyone who would engage with him. It was like being in his own private book club. Anyone who visited him at his place was likely to leave with a book as a parting gift. As my dad got older and his eyes got worse, he really missed having the ability to read and to escape into the world of spies and detectives, two of his favorite genres. I am confident that my dad's most favorite role in life was being a grandparent and a great-grandparent. His grandchildren, Josh, Chase, Drake, Connor, and Lydia, and his great-grandchildren, Theo and Miller, all adored him, and he loved them so much. My dad was so proud of us kids and his grandkids, and he told us often. My kids were blessed to live nearby, and they were able to spend a lot of time with Grandpa. Grandpa Bob always took an interest in everything they were doing, and he wanted to know every detail about school, sports, cheerleading, camp, friends. Anything that interested my kids was interesting to him. He had a really special bond with my kids. He went to every one of Lydia's dance recitals. He was amazed by Drake's ability to do computer coding, and he shared a secret handshake with Connor that he did every single time they said goodbye. Connor says there were only 2 occasions where the handshake didn't happen. One time a few years ago when he simply forgot, and the other a few days before my dad died, when my dad could no longer do it. My dad never forgot a birthday, and he would make my kids clever homemade cards filled with amusing facts and stories. My dad was very close with his brother, Arthur, and Arthur's wife, Barbette, and their kids, my cousins, John, Deb, Karen, and all of their kids. We spent a lot of time with our cousins growing up, and we also have a very close bond. He cherished the times when he was with them, including trips he would take with them from time to time. And when Ross and I got married, my dad welcomed Ross's wife, Robin, and my husband, Craig, to the family with open arms. He loved them both very much. Craig and I spent a lot of time with my dad, taking him to dinner, shopping with him, hanging out with him at his place, taking him to all of his appointments. We tried to spend as much time with him as we could, and I know he appreciated our visits. Finally, there was, of course, my mom, Lois, who left us almost 25 years ago at age 59. She and my dad weren't married at the time she died, but they shared a lot of loving and wonderful years as husband and wife. In fact, my dad has chosen his final resting spot directly next to my mom, and we hope she will be welcoming him with open arms, remembering all the good years they spent together. As my dad got older, his mind stayed as sharp as ever, but his body did not keep up. My dad could speak on almost any topic, and if he couldn't, he would be sure to research it, so he could discuss and sometimes debate it later. He knew about a lot of things, making him an ace at crossword puzzles and a pro at Jeopardy! But physically, my dad struggled over the last several years, and eventually he got to a point where he mostly stayed home. Last year, he was diagnosed with bladder cancer, and he fractured his hip several months ago, and he began to decline. It was really tough on Craig and I over the last several years when he needed regular assistance with many aspects of his life, and we did everything we could to help him. Craig and I were grateful that Ross and Robin moved back to Chicago in January. A little over a month ago, my dad went on hospice. He had a full-time caretaker and several nurses who stopped by and visited with him. Every single one of them adored my dad. He would tell me they had wonderful visits where they talked about jazz and books and life, and then they would call me and text me and tell me how much they enjoyed being with him, how special he was, and what an honor it was to care for him. In the end, Ross, Robin, Craig, and I were by our dad's side when he passed away peacefully in his home. My dad went by many names: Robert, Bob, Bobby, Never Rob, Never Robbie, and to his grandchildren he was Grandpa, Baba, and G-Bob. My dad called my kids by a variety of names: Drakester, Lydia, Kiddos, Butchie. My dad called me Belzy and Bells. It came from Annabelle, which wasn't actually my name. I got to hear it one last time shortly before my dad passed. I'll miss that. I'll miss him. I loved him very much.
Listening to the rabbi and Robert's children, of course, bring back memories not only for me, but for all of us. And I would just like briefly to share with you a conversation that Robert and I had probably about a year ago. One of us, I don't remember which one of us, had read something that had been written by a prominent person. I don't remember who it was. But what they said was that the way you die is more important than the way you live. And when he talked about dying, when we talked to one another about it, it wasn't the last days when your body fails you, when your mind fails you. It's that time in your life that you're no longer as creative as you had been before, when you are no longer able to do the things that you were able to do when you were younger. And in many ways, the way that my brother Robert lived after his professional career, after the things that he really truly did accomplish, the way that he lived over the last 20-some years of his life really proved the kind of a person that he was, the kind of a mensch that he was, and proved very, very firmly in my mind, and I think particularly in the younger people among us mind, that the way that he died was every bit as important as the way that he had lived.
Hi, I'm Josh Loevy. I'm Baba's eldest grandson. I wanted to share a story that is indicative of who he was to me, and I think who he was to a lot of people. As a lot of us have mentioned already, Baba was an avid reader, and that was something that he and I shared an affinity for. In particular, both of us really loved to read Scandinavian crime fiction. And so it was 2014. I was living in Kansas City, and I just had randomly come across a book called The Redbreast. And it was a book written by Jo Nesbø, who's a Norwegian author. And I read the book, and as I was reading it, I kept thinking to myself, gosh, this is something that Baba would really love. He would really enjoy this book. And so I finished the book, and the first call I made, as it so often was when I would finish books, was to Baba. And I said, I just read this fantastic book. You have to read it. And I kid you not, his first words were, it wasn't by chance The Redbreast, was it? And I said, it was. He said, I am holding in my hand a copy of The Redbreast, and I have a posted note written on the inside of it that says, recommend to Josh. And this was not a new book. This was not a current New York Times bestseller. This was a deep cut. And so that memory, obviously, it was so strange, and so it stuck out in my mind in that way, but it was also so indicative of who Baba was, because he was the type of person who forged connections with people through interests and through curiosity. And that's the legacy, I think, that I will take from him, is that it is okay to be a vigorous consumer of information, because that's what he was. He had a voracious appetite for learning things, and he always had that, and he had that up until the end of his life. And that's something that he modeled for me, and that I've tried to take into my own life and to build connections with people in that way. And it continued again through his life, whether it was through books with myself and my wife Morgan, or through the music of Baby Shark with my son Theo. It was building those connections with people. And so I'll always take that with me from him, and it'll continue even as the next Jo Nesbø book comes out next Tuesday. I'll always have that to think of him and to keep him at the forefront of my mind. And so I'm of course grateful to him for that, and I will always think of him fondly.
Grandpa Bob, or G Bob as I like to call him, was very special. He made everyone feel loved and valued. Whenever I had a problem or needed advice, he was there, ready to listen and offer his wise words. I couldn't talk about Grandpa Bob without mentioning our secret handshake. I'm not quite sure how it came into existence, but it became our unique way of connecting with each other. Whenever we did the handshake, it brought a smile to both of our faces. As I grew older, our secret handshake remained a tradition. I also remember going to Grandpa's favorite restaurant, Wildberry. The line to get in was always long, but it was worth the wait. I always knew that when we got to our table, I could count on Grandpa to order his favorite meal, French toast with berries. I will miss Grandpa Bob deeply. I'll miss his wise words, and I will miss performing our secret handshake.
As many of you have already mentioned, we all had different names for him. Some called him Robert, some called him Bob, and some had really personal names which he refused to let anyone else call him. But for myself, he was simply and affectionately Grandpa Bob. Even before I was born, Grandpa Bob was always involved in my life. My parents used to take tons of videos when we were younger, investing a bunch of money in a camcorder in a time before phones, so we could go back and rewatch those early memories. One of those videos really stuck out to me, the very first video actually, and the video showed my grandparents sitting in the hospital lobby as I'm being born. And for some context, months earlier, when the hospital did an ultrasound, they elected to keep my gender a secret until I was born. So they actually had two names for me. If I was a girl, I was going to be Madeline, and if I was a guy, which I would be Drake. Anyway, in the video, my dad tells the grandparents that I am Drake, and Grandpa Bob, the first to speak, announced proudly, "Drakester." You could hear the genuine excitement in his voice when he heard the announcement. He was always extremely excited to be a part of our lives. Throughout my life, he would always take interest in my hobbies and interests, even if he didn't understand a single thing about it. He always made me very excited to share things with him, because even when he didn't understand the topic, he would ask me lots of questions, showing that he really wanted to connect to us. If we came to visit another time, he would always research these things ahead of time so we'd have better conversations with us. For example, over the past year in school, I worked on my senior thesis where I created a game using virtual reality. And sure enough, when I came to visit during a break, he had prepared by printing out a bunch of articles about virtual reality that he had found and thought I'd be interested in reading. Those little things really had a way of making me feel super special, even later in my life when I realized that this treatment was not exclusive to myself or my family, but pretty much everyone who stepped foot into his home. I'd like to conclude by thanking Grandpa Bob for everything he has done for me. All of his wisdom from a life well lived will live on through myself and everyone else who was fortunate enough to share a moment or have a conversation with him. I love you, Grandpa Bob, and I hope wherever you are now treats you as well as you treated all of us throughout our lives.
Hello. To start, I'm going to share a letter I received last year. Lydia, my heart swelled with love at the first sight when I met you and your brother. A super special day in November when I became Grandpa Bob one more time. One of the most endearing joys in my life in life is to be a grandfather and have a smart, beautiful granddaughter like you as icing on the cake. This was only the beginning of a letter he wrote me before one of my cheer competitions last winter, and one of many I would receive for various big and small occasions and milestones. Some contain creative rhymes, others contain lists of funny facts, statistics, or jokes, some with his own childhood anecdotes, and others with meaningful advice that was specific to each of us. Grandpa Bob was truly the best grandfather I could ever ask for, and I'm so grateful I was able to have him in my life. He's also the smartest and kindest man I knew. Despite our pop culture generational gap, he always took interest in whatever latest fad I was into and took his time to research or share a book that he had on that topic. I think I may still have his calligraphy book or the book of fonts that he shared with me years ago. Finally, I'm so grateful that he was able to watch me grow up. From going to all my dance recitals and early birthday parties, watching me become a bat mitzvah, graduate high school, and this year start college, he was always there to celebrate with me. And although he didn't tumble or flip like me, he was truly my biggest cheerleader. I will miss him so much.
Anyone else have a story they'd like to share? You don't have to do it today. After all, there is the family reception after the service today with the information in the memorial folder, and there's the rest of your lives together where you can recall Robert at his best, and remember him when he impacted your life such that you are here today to remember him surrounded by his family and friends. At this time, we will be lowering Bob's casket into the grave. This can be a difficult moment in the funeral process because it is a time to say goodbye in its own way. I invite us to reflect silently on his connection to your life and on the memories you carry with you from this place as the casket is lowered. With earth from the land of Israel cast upon the grave, connecting Robert to the birthplace of his people, the vault will now be closed, and then each of us will have the opportunity to partake of the mitzvah, the good deed of honoring the deceased by casting a shovelful or 2 or 3 of earth upon the grave. This connects us to this place, leaving a piece of us here with Robert and with his family as well. It is a chance for us to fulfill this mitzvah on our own volition. It is traditional to use the shovel for 1 or 2 or 3 shovelfuls as you are moved, and then to return the shovel to the earth so each person themselves can freely take it upon themselves to lift that shovel and to leave a piece of them in this space with Robert. And so after the vault is closed, I will invite first his close family forward, and then all who are here to give this final tribute to Robert. At this time, I'll invite Robert's family to come forward. You can go on either side. So you can come on the other side.
It's not acceptable.
Friends, if there's anyone who wanted to sign the register book who did not have an opportunity prior to the service, we are going to have that off to the side as well if you'd like to take a moment to do so.
Actually, less cold than this thing.
Is it?
Yeah.
The other way is lower.
And you made a spitting image of your mother.
Thank you for coming.
Sure
I
thing.
appreciate it. So it's made to see connected with teachers on Facebook.
Friends, this does conclude the services today. We thank everyone for attending and for those who attended via the live stream as well. We are going to be ending the live stream at this time. And again, just a reminder, if anyone else needed to sign the register book, we'll have it out for just a few moments here before the family departs. They will be starting with the final interment in just a moment. For those of you who wish to remain, you are welcome to do so. Otherwise, you're also welcome to return to your cars.